In an industry saturated with remakes, sequels, and other familiar franchises, it's always worth celebrating whenever we get a new IP that is exciting as Phantom Blade Zero. More specifically, Phantom Blade Zero is being developed by Chinese developer S-Game. It follows a recent wave of developers throughout Asia, aside from the ones in Japan, now making single-player complete console games. We've seen this from South Korea with games like Stellar Blade and Lies of P, and we're also seeing it from China with games like Black Myth Wukong and of course Phantom Blade Zero, a game that got a major update at Summer Games Fest that has me tremendously excited. This is a game when I first saw footage of, I could not believe it was even real. The combat looks out of this world, and I think this is what so many of you are looking for in an action RPG. So please go ahead and hit that subscribe button. We are pushing toward 99k to get to 100k by the end of the year. And guys, we are so close, so please push us over the edge. The team behind Phantom Blade Zero says that they want to capture the creativity and spirit of PS1 and PS2 era action games. That's right, they want to make this a soulful experience. And speaking of a Souls game, you may look at this and think that it's a Souls-like. However, according to the developers, it's more like Devil May Cry, in the sense that it's fast-paced and hyper-aggressive. However, after getting to speak to some very knowledgeable action game players who actually did get to play this game at Summer Games Fest, they certainly did not agree with the assertion that it played more like Devil May Cry. Of course, you can kind of surmise that just by looking at the footage. It's certainly a lot more combo-driven and expressive than a lot of Souls games. This to me sounds a little bit closer to what Stellar Blade is, a game with plenty of room for expression and different combos, while having the type of challenge and boss design you'd expect from a Souls game. The game is heavily inspired by Chinese wuxia martial arts, and you can see that in just how acrobatic and fast-paced the game is. This also includes a lot of animation cancels with primary weapons. In total, the developers say there'll be over 30 weapons in the game, which is a pretty large weapon variety. There's also secondary weapons known as Phantom Edge, and these include things like a bow and arrow and even a cannon. It's important to note that when doing actions such as blocking, you'll also have a stamina meter. Stamina in this game is known as the Sha Chi meter, right below your health. But it's not just you, the player, with this stamina bar. The enemies also have the stamina bar as well, with the player or the enemy's guard being broken once the Sha Chi meter reaches 0. Enemies will also be able to block your attacks, making attacking at the most opportune times, parrying, and other ways of finding openings incredibly important in this game's combat. Of course, it would also seem you can drain your opponent's stamina by being super aggressive. The game's level design is also set to be multi-layered, with plenty of hidden secrets to find, meaning you'll want to explore every nook and cranny every single inch. There's also a lot of contextual movement such as wall running, with there also being contextual movement inside of combat. We also got an update on the game's development from Bleebly.com. The game commenced development in 2022. The core gameplay and basic framework has been completed now, and the next step is to fill the content. Release date is still a while off. That is to say that even though this game had a demo at Summer Games Fest, you shouldn't expect to see this one anytime soon. That means not this year or next year. I'm thinking bare minimum 2026, but honestly, possibly even 2027. Just like Black Myth Wukong, this game also received investment from Tencent. In March 2023, the devs met a friend in San Francisco who works for Sony. He was very excited when watching the gameplay video and recommended them to Shuhei Yoshida and Christian Svensson, and asked the devs if they wanted to show it at the showcase. They also said that Sony gives a lot of support both on the development side and the marketing side, and the consoles in some demo events are all provided by them. It should come as no surprise then that Phantom Blade Zero is a PS5 console exclusive, though for those who aren't console gamers, it's also coming to PC as well. Development costs to date are 200 million Chinese yuan, that is 28 million United States dollars, with full development cost expected to be 400 million Chinese yuan, which is around $55 million, not factoring engineering and marketing, this is a pretty reasonable budget for a AAA game, as they can extend well into $100 million or way more. So I am pretty surprised to hear that budget, and hopefully they're able to stay within it. They also say you won't need to play any previous Phantom Blood titles in order to play this one. Now this may come as a surprise. If your reaction is, there's other Phantom Blade titles? Then you and I had the exact same reaction. However, apparently there was a Phantom Blade Executioner's mobile game that came out last year, with an extremely different art style and presentation. In an interview with MP First, the developers were asked, quote, "I was curious if you recommend playing the mobile games before playing the worldwide release, or would that spoil the story? The mobile game Phantom Blade Executioners is the prequel to Phantom Blade Zero. Playing it will give you some background of the characters and world. No spoilers for sure. PBX tells a story when Soul is relatively younger. He was fighting alongside other executioners of the Order, such as names that I don't want to butcher, and maybe others who are still his friends. But when it comes to Phantom Blade Zero, you'll see something really tragic happening. Soul becomes the traitor for some reason, heavily wounded, and all the former friends are now enemies. I think it's kind of like watching a prequel movie of John Wick, if there was one. In that case, you may see a younger John Wick with some cool friends, and then you begin to watch the actual John Wick series and see how he has to kill them all. The main story will take you around 20 to 30 hours. It's also going to have multiple endings, a ton of side content, and exploration. So even though the story is going to be around 20 or 30 hours long, if you really want to, you're going to get way more hours from the game than this. Though it does seem there's a bit of confusion on this. In another interview, when asked how long is the game, they said that it was 30 to 40 hours. Again, this game is still deep in development, and so I'm sure that they don't even quite know themselves, as they're still building a lot of the content out right now. They also said that the in-game content includes multiplayer dungeons, boss rushes, roguelike abysses, and more. But as always, when in doubt, you should trust the smaller number, because it's usually more accurate to be true. Now you might be wondering if this game is open world or linear. The developers said, quote, "It's not that kind of vast open world you need a horse to ride from point A to point B, but it does have multiple paths and some open world elements. This to me reminds me a lot of something like Stellar Blade, which had some open world type areas and then also had several linear type dungeons. As I've mentioned a few times before, I really do like this blend of open world and linear sections. Part of the problem with open world is I think once you're in an open world for 100+ hours, getting bored and getting some open world fatigue is going to be inevitable. And so having some linear, tightly paced dungeons is always going to be incredibly refreshing for the player. In a similar fashion, I don't really like games that restrict you the entire time that you're playing it, constantly funneling you down a linear hallway where you fight enemies, watch a cutscene, rinse and repeat. I think there is a strong need to always have gameplay variety throughout, and it seems like they have considered this quite heavily with Phantom Blade Zero. The team says that the three main sources of inspiration are Metal Gear Rising, Sifu, and Bloodborne. And speaking of Bloodborne, a former FromSoft art director is now working at S-Game, a man from Hong Kong named Michael, who influenced the art style of Demon's Souls and Dark Souls 1. He was previously involved in outsourcing works, and now is officially part of the studio. Other forms of media that were inspirational include Gulang's Wuxia titles, as well as Berserk, Vagabond, Blade of the Immortal, and 80s and 90s Hong Kong kung fu action movies. Ultimately, this is a game that has me incredibly excited. Of course, while I love Japanese games, it's cool to see other developers throughout Asia also making AAA console games. I think it's incredibly refreshing, and ultimately there's nothing I'd love more than seeing every country having its own thriving game industry, where they can bring their unique cultures into video games and expand all of our horizons. But these are my thoughts on Phantom Blade Zero, and I'd love to hear yours in the comments below. And I'll see you all in the next video. Later, guys.